They called him a visionary. They called him the Builder King. But history remembers him by another name, the Butcher of the Congo, in the late 19th century, while Europe spoke of civilization and progress. King Leopold II of Belgium looked across the ocean and saw not people but profit. The Congo was his kingdom in the shadows, a land drenched in gold, ivory, and rubber. And under his rule it became a river of blood. Men were chained to trees, women beaten, children mutilated, for failing to meet impossible quotas. Villages burned, smoke rising like prayers unanswered. He hid it all behind polite words and royal speeches. He called it a Congo Free State, but it was nothing free about it. Only screams echoing through the jungle and the silence of those who could not speak again. For 2 decades the world looked away, until the photographs came, until the witnesses spoke, and the truth crawled out from the dark. 10 million lives lost to one man's greed. Leopold built palaces with their pain. He decorated his throne with the bones of the forgotten. And when the world finally saw what he had done, he tried to bury the evidence, burn the papers, silence the ghosts. But some fires never die, because history remembers what kings want to erase. The Congo still whispers his name, not with reverence, but with rage. Deep inside the heart of Africa, the air was thick with the scent of earth and fear. The Congo River glimmered under a merciless sun, carrying silent cries on its current. Villagers once free now moved like ghosts among the trees, their eyes hollow, their voices gone. Because the jungle no longer belonged to them, it belonged to the king across the sea, a man they had never seen, yet one whose shadow reached into every corner of their lives. Leopold called it progress, he called it civilization. But every tree that fell, every drop of sap that turned to rubber was paid for in blood. The agents who served him wore clean uniforms and polite smiles. They wrote in ledgers and spoke in the language of trade. But their rifles spoke louder. Every bullet a reminder that this paradise was now a prison. Men were forced to collect rubber from the vines that wrapped around ancient trees. They climbed barefoot until their hands split open and their skin tore against the bark. The rubber hardened on their bodies like chains, and when they failed to gather enough, the punishment came swift and merciless. Hands cut off to prove obedience, lives taken to prove control. The overseers rode to the villages with whips and ledgers, counting lives like currency. The ivory hunters filled crates with tusks and bodies. Steamships carried riches down the river, while silence spread through the land. Each shipment a treasure for Leopold, each scream an offering to his greed. In Brussels, the king smiled at ceremonies. He spoke of humanitarian duty. He promised light to a dark continent. But in the Congo, that light was fire, consuming everything it touched. Missionaries wrote secret letters describing the horror, but few believed them. How could the civilized world imagine such darkness wearing a crown? Children hid in the tall grass when they heard footsteps. Women prayed that the soldiers would pass their huts. Fathers were taken to the forest and never returned. The jungle, once alive with song, now echoed only with the sound of chains dragging through the mud. Every man who survived carried the mark of the whip. Every woman who lived carried the silence of grief. And still they worked, because behind every overseer stood another armed man, and behind him stood a king who demanded more. From the shorelines to the rivers, the corpses floated quietly. The birds would not sing near the trading posts. The smell of rubber and death filled the air until the jungle itself seemed to mourn. Nature wept for her children, but her tears turned to blood in the soil. Rumors began to spread. Stories whispered between villages. A time would come when this suffering would be seen, when the white ships that came for rubber would carry witnesses instead, when the jungle would no longer be silent. And in the dark corners of Leopold's palace, documents were hidden, reports sealed with wax and gold. The king knew the truth of his empire. He knew that every brick of his palace was built on the bones of a child, and yet he called himself a savior. The Congo's rivers remembered every scream, every spark of resistance buried deep under roots, waiting for the world to listen. Because even in chains, even in pain, the people refused to vanish. Their eyes told stories the king could never erase. The jungle endured. It whispered its truth to the wind and the water. And those whispers began to travel farther, across oceans, across borders, carrying a single question into the heart of Europe. How long can a king hide behind the smoke of his own fire? And so the stage was set. A kingdom of silence ruled by a man of greed. But silence has a way of breaking, and soon the sound of truth would reach the palace gates. In Europe, the streets of Brussels glowed with gold and pride. The people called their king a genius, a man of vision, who had brought glory to a small nation. Every newspaper praised him. Every speech echoed his name like a prayer. They saw the palaces. He built the monuments that pierced the sky. But none of them saw the blood beneath the marble. None of them heard the cries beneath the music of celebration. Leopold called his empire the Congo Free State. He spoke of roads and schools of progress and faith. He sent explorers and missionaries with silver crosses and empty promises. He told the world he had given Africa light, but in truth, he had only given it fire. Behind every word of progress was a whip. Behind every prayer was a scream. The king's office overflowed with reports and letters. Ship after ship brought riches from the Congo, ivory that gleamed like bone, rubber that smelled of death. His officers sent numbers written in neat columns. But those numbers were not trade, they were lives. Every pound of rubber was a body, every coin a heartbeat stopped. Europe believed his story because it wanted to believe. It wanted to see empire as destiny, not cruelty. The world was addicted to his lie because truth was too heavy to carry. And Leopold knew how to hide behind masks. He hid behind charity and church, behind flags and medals. He spoke softly but ruled through fear. He created an army not of soldiers, but of ghosts. The forced public men taken from their homes turned against their own. They followed orders written in ink, but carried out in blood. Villages that resisted vanished. Rivers that refused to flow were filled with the dead. The jungle itself grew quiet under the weight of his empire. But lies have limits, and truth has a voice that never sleeps. A few men who saw the horror refused to look away. A missionary named William Shepherd began to write. He described the burned villages, the mutilated children, the rivers of corpses. A man named Edmund Morel saw the shipping records. He realized that weapons and chains went in while rubber and gold came out. No trade, no fairness, only theft and suffering. Their words began to travel faster than the king's lies. Pamphlets spread through London, through Paris, through New York. The world began to whisper. Could it be true? Could a civilized king be the greatest monster of all? The palace tried to silence them, but silence cannot stop a storm. Leopold ordered his men to burn evidence. Documents disappeared. Witnesses vanished. He built walls of deception so high that truth had to climb through the cracks. But the cracks were widening. Photographs appeared. Images of men, without hands, of women staring into nothingness. The pictures told what words could not. And the world began to see what it had ignored for too long. In the Congo, the people felt something changing. The jungle seemed to breathe again. The air carried new sounds. Hope whispered among the leaves. They did not know the names of Shepherd or Morel, but they felt their strength, because every truth spoken across the ocean made the chains a little weaker. In Belgium, the king grew restless. He held meetings in secret rooms, his fingers tapping on maps soaked in red. He knew his empire was built on bones and fear, but he also knew that fear fades when the world begins to watch. So he tried to rewrite the story. He spoke of misunderstanding. He spoke of slander. He said the Congo loved him, that his mission was divine. But no crown can cover the stench of blood. Newspapers began to change their tone. Cartoons showed him with blood dripping from his hands. Protests filled the streets. The word genocide was not yet born, but its shadow already walked among men. And still he denied, still he smiled, still he hid behind the walls of his empire of lies. The jungle waited patiently. It had seen empires rise and fall. It had buried conquerors before, and it knew that the day would come when the truth would swallow the king whole. For now he stood tall in his marble halls, surrounded by wealth and whispers. But in the distance thunder rolled over the Congo, not from the sky, but from the hearts of those who had survived. The empire of lies was cracking, and the ghosts of the jungle were beginning to march toward the throne. The walls of the palace were still lined with gold, but the air around King Leopold had begun to rot. The silence that once obeyed him now echoed with whispers. Whispers of truth carried across oceans and borders. The world was beginning to see what lay behind the velvet curtains and the royal mask. Outside his kingdom, storms of words raged. Newspapers printed what could no longer be denied. Missionaries told stories that chilled even the hearts of kings. The photographs spread like wildfire. Children without hands, men. Without hope, women without names. The civilized world looked at its own reflection and saw the face of a monster wearing a crown. Leopold called it treason. He called it conspiracy against progress. But the mirror does not lie, and neither did the jungle. Every tree, every river, every grave bore witness to what he had done. He tried to build new lies to bury the old ones. But the truth kept digging its way out to the soil of the Congo and the marble of Brussels. Meetings were held in London. Men in suits and ties spoke of human rights for the first time. Reporters printed the words that kings feared most. The word murder, the word empire, the word guilt, the word shame. The voices of the dead began to rise through the pages. Every article became a weapon, every word a crack in the throne. The king who once commanded millions could not silence a single truth anymore. The Congo had become a wound the world could not ignore. His advisors begged him to surrender the colony, to give up the Congo before the fire reached his own palace. But greed had eaten his soul. He called it his property, his legacy, his divine right. He believed he was chosen by history itself. But history was already sharpening its blade. In the Congo, the forced public began to falter. Orders were disobeyed. The soldiers no longer saw glory, only guilt. Whispers of rebellion moved through the ranks. The same hands that once killed for him now trembled under the weight of what they had done. The jungle itself seemed to turn against him. Storms tore down outposts, floods erased trading stations, as if nature herself had chosen to wash his crimes away. By 1908, the pressure was too much. The Belgian government stepped in. They stripped Leopold of his private rule. The Congo Free State became a colony of the crown. But there was nothing free about it. It was only the beginning of a different mask. Yet for Leopold, it was the end of his empire of terror. He sat in his palace, surrounded by gold and ghosts. The applause of the world had faded. The halls that once echoed with pride now whispered with guilt. He ordered servants to burn his papers. Thousands of documents went up in flames. Letters, ledgers, reports. He thought he could erase history the way he erased lives. But ashes cannot hide screams, and smoke cannot hide the stench of blood. The king aged quickly. His hair turned white, his hands shook. He avoided mirrors, he avoided silence, because in silence he could hear them. The footsteps of the children he enslaved, the cries of the mothers he orphaned, the breath of the men he killed for rubber and gold. He tried to buy forgiveness with monuments and charity. He built statues of saints to hide the soul of the devil. But the people had seen too much. The world had seen too much. There is no monument that can silence the ghosts of millions. When death finally came for him, it was quiet and unceremonious. No crowd, no soldiers, no music. Only the ticking of a clock and the heavy breath of a man who finally realized what eternity feels like. He left behind a legacy written not in ink, but in blood. 10 million lives. 10 million stories. 10 million reasons why history will never forget. Outside his window, the bells of Brussels rang cold and distant. The same bells that once sang his name now sounded like judgment. And as his heart stopped, the rain began to fall. They said it was a calm evening, but those who listened closely swore they could hear it. The whisper of the jungle carried on the wind. The Congo calling back what was stolen. The king was gone, but the curse of his greed lived on. The scars of his rule carved deep into the heart of Africa. An empire built on pain finally swallowed by the truth. And in the silence that followed, history exhaled. The king was gone, but the jungle still remembered. The wind still carried the scent of smoke. The earth still whispered the names of the dead. The rivers flowed quietly over bones and roots. Every ripple of memory, every shadow a reminder of what was taken and what refused to die. Years passed and empires changed faces. New flags rose over old wounds. Belgium claimed the land, but the ghosts did not care about crowns or borders. They lived in the trees and the soil and the silence between raindrops. They watched the cities grow over graves, and the children play where their ancestors once wept. The Congo tried to heal, but healing comes slow to land soaked in blood. The people carried scars that could not be seen, but could always be felt. A mother's gaze, a father's silence, a child's question that no elder could answer. Why did it happen? Who allowed it to be? The answers had burned with the papers Leopold destroyed. But the truth has its own way of surviving. Stories began to return home, carried by voices that refused to be silent. Missionaries spoke of courage, not despair. Writers told tales not of kings, but of survivors. The world began to see the Congo not as darkness, but as endurance, a place where pain had not destroyed hope, where history had not buried humanity. In Europe, the name Leopold grew heavy. Statues stood tall, but people began to look at them differently, not as monuments of glory, but as warnings carved in stone. Some were defaced, some were pulled down. Each crack a small victory, each empty pedestal a reminder that time does not protect the guilty. The ghosts did not seek revenge. They sought memory, because memory is justice when justice is denied. Every song sung in the Congo, every drumbeat in the night, became an act of remembrance. Every story passed down by a grandmother became resistance, because forgetting would mean dying twice. Scholars uncovered what the king had tried to burn. Hidden letters, reports, testimonies. Words that had slept in darkness for a century, now rising like dawn. And the world began to count the uncountable. 10 million lives gone for rubber, for ivory, for greed. 10 million souls turned into numbers, and numbers into lessons. The jungle had kept its promise. It had not forgotten. The new world spoke of human rights and progress. But the Congo knew better. It knew that civilization without conscience is only another mask. It knew that the greed of one man can echo through generations, and that the ghosts of empire never truly rest. They only wait for silence to return. Still the people endured. They built again. They sang again. They turned pain into rhythm and grief into strength. Children played where soldiers once marched, their laughter rising above the ruins like light over shadow. The ghosts watched and smiled for the first time in centuries, because life had returned, because truth had survived. In the distance, the jungle breathed again. The trees grew tall over forgotten graves. The river carried stories, not screams. The air was heavy, but no longer haunted. It was as if the land itself had forgiven, though it would never forget. Historians would write books, governments would make apologies. But the Real story lived not in museums or speeches. It lived in the soil and the people, in the endless pulse of the Congo. The empire was gone, but the spirit remained, and with it the warning that the price of silence is always paid in blood. As the sun set over the river, the jungle glowed gold and red, the same colors that once marked its suffering, now marking its rebirth. The wind whispered through the trees, not in pain, but in remembrance, not as a curse, but as a lesson. They said the ghosts of the Congo had finally found peace. But maybe it was not peace. Maybe it was a promise that history will never again be written only by kings, but by those who survived them. And in that promise the jungle slept, alive, aware, eternal.